Hey everyone, welcome to the Them Before Us podcast. You are here with Jen, your host, and today we're having a conversation with another one of our pro-child politics authors, Jon Schweppe, who is the policy director for American Principles Project. In this role, he's served as an important advocate in the fight to protect kids from online pornography. He co-authored the groundbreaking 2020 report, Protecting Free Speech and Defending Kids, a proposal to amend Section 230, which advocated for imposing civil liability on websites that distribute pornographic content to minors. Schweppe has developed model legislation, lobbied legislators, and testified on behalf of age verification in half a dozen states. He's now working on a federal anti-pornography initiative that he hopes will be implemented by the next Republican administration. God willing, sooner rather than later, we have one of those. But Jon, welcome to Them For Us podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so we are going to get into your chapter you wrote for pro-child politics in a little bit, but as our listeners know, I love to start with more of that human element. So we'd love it if you just told us a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, maybe who's in your family, and what brought you to the American Principles Project.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town in rural Illinois. My dad was a Lutheran minister and my mom was a nurse. So not the traditional, East Coast background, I suppose. But I went to school for business and economics. And then the Tea Party wave happened back in 2010. And I was really moved by that. Thought it was a really important moment in our political, history. And so I got involved with that movement and started engaging in campaigns and elections. And I did that for a few years. And then ultimately came out to Washington, D.C. around 2014 to work at American Principles Project. And I've been working there ever since. So about 10 years now serving as our policy director, which means I basically oversee all of our legislative priorities, our political priorities, and try to actually make things happen. So it's been a joy, a real fun ride. But I'm at an organization now that I think is growing and doing a lot of good work. So I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about what the American Principles Project is. I'm assuming it's a nonprofit.
Yeah, so we were founded in 2009 as kind of an answer to the Obama agenda. Robbie George was one of our founders at the time. And the organization's kind of made some changes over the years since then. But around 2016, we saw what happened in North Carolina to Governor McCrory. And maybe some of your listeners will remember this, but McCrory signed the bathroom bill, HB 2, into law. And literally every left-wing institution, including like the National Basketball Association and some others, they came down on North Carolina and basically bullied the voters into voting against the Republicans, into promoting men in women's locker rooms, men in women's bathrooms. And McCrory ended up losing that race by 10,000 votes. But one of the things we took away when we came out of that race, I think we spent something like $200,000, $300,000 on his behalf as a super PAC. But, there weren't a lot of conservative groups there to kind of be that cavalry. And so our founder, or our president, I should say, Terry Schilling, came out of that thinking, okay, we got to become that organization. And so over the years, we've continued to engage in campaigns and elections. We've built up our super PAC. And this year, we plan to spend somewhere between $18 and $20 million helping pro-family candidates win and hopefully taking out the bad guys. And so this is, I think really important work. We got to continue to grow. We still could use help from other groups and get them doing the same thing. But, I think that if we're able to be successful in this project, I think it'll really help strengthen the Republican Party and hopefully help making it, where there's a punishment if you vote against families.
Yeah, there's been a lot of frustration recently, I think, with the kind of lay conservative Christian against both major parties, because I think with Trump's influence, there's been a big kind of let's walk back our language around pro-life and let's walk back our language around marriage. So it's pretty encouraging that we've got folks who are really fighting for consistent conservative principles, right? Actually thinking that there's something worth conserving when it comes to marriage, protecting life, and then the topic that it seems like you're really passionate about is fighting back against pornography. So that's why you were tapped to write this chapter. Can you share with us a little bit why is that topic in particular so important to you to fight against?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I mean, obviously, I'm a millennial male, so I'd be lying to you if I said I haven't ever looked at pornography. Obviously, I have, and that's true for most people in my generation. But for me, I think the motivation here is less about personal and more about my kids. So I am married, and I have four boys with a fifth boy on the way. My oldest boy is 6 years old, and so I kind of feel like we're on the clock to get something done here because as we know, and I cover this, in the book chapter, the average age that kids are first exposed to pornography is 11, 12 years old now. And so I can be, the best parent, the most involved parent in the world. But the reality is that my oldest, whether he's homeschooled or what, it is likely, the statistics bear this out, that he will be exposed to pornography in the current environment. And so certainly this is an important mission for me. I want to protect my kids and I want to help kids across the country because I know that pornography is so harmful.
That's a great point. And I think your point applies to both male and female. Same thing for me. And it's funny how much you might stumble across it more than you're actively looking for it. At least now, hopefully parents can know a little more about what's going on and be a little more proactive. But we'll get into more that parents alone can't prevent your kids from seeing anything ever unless you were actually locked up into your room with no kind of device or anything, right? But we'll get into that more of why parents, I mean, the government, there's a place for the government to also be a part of fighting back against this in addition to parents. We talk about this with our chapters in pro-child politics, that every chapter will highlight the story of kids. It's going to talk about the big lies, and it's going to talk about the truth of the subject. So one of the big lies from your chapter in pro-child politics is that pornography is free speech. So, just anecdotally, I think all of us have kind of heard things like that, probably from the people who are making money out of the porn industry, right? Abusing people and making money. Hey, this is free speech and we have to protect it. Why do you say that that's a lie?
Well, historically, that just hasn't been the case. Since the founding, we've had obscenity laws in this country that, basically prevent indecent and obscene material from being, distributed in public. And by the way, even in 2024, these obscenity laws are still effectively working. If you go out in public right now, it would be shocking and you would see police involved if someone was walking around naked. Or if, two people decided to have, intercourse somewhere in a public place, like this would not be acceptable. But yet we've kind of established a precedent. It's partly the Supreme Court's fault. It's partly, I think, the fault of our politics to a degree, where we just accept that the internet is the secret place that we're just not going to talk about and we're not going to touch. But, what's happened is that this stuff has gotten so not just perverse, but pervasive. And so it's literally everywhere. You mentioned the device thing. And I keep hearing this from folks, hearing stories about this, but, kids will often have a device you don't even know about, right? Even before teenage years. And so it's just impossible to protect them from this stuff. And ultimately it should be, I mean, this is common sense and it's dated back to our founding. It should be illegal to distribute as an adult obscene material to a minor. That is sexualization of a child. That should be, you should go to prison for that. But in this country, we've just kind of accepted that, oh, this is just something that porn sites do. But that is changing. And that's why I think there's a lot of room for encouragement and excitement.
Yeah, that's great. Good points. I think there's also been kind of a recent movement. It seems similar in some ways to people saying that being morbidly obese is healthy now, that people are saying sex work, let's call it sex work, can be ethical. So I looked up a few things. Human Rights Watch had an article, Why Sex Work Should Be Decriminalized. NPR says, decriminalizing sex work. Some activists say it's time. So they're kind of reframing both prostitution and the porn industry as, well, there can be ethical forms of it. So how would you answer people that say, let's ban the unethical, but let's keep the ethical forms and let's change the name and call it sex work? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think there's no ethical way to show pornography to a child, actually. And, I think about this a lot with, comparable issues like, well, alcohol, for example. Like, could a parent, find a reason to, say, give a beer, a Miller Lite, to their 16-year-old child while watching, a basketball game on TV? I would say, actually, that there is a case for that's not necessarily insane. There's no case, no good parenting case for a parent showing a child pornography, right? And certainly, if that's the case, there shouldn't be a case for a stranger showing our children pornography. And that's ultimately what's happening here. Sometimes we get a little bit lost with, oh, internet is just very confusing. The porn sites know they are distributing their content to minors. The technology is there, if they wanted to implement it, to prevent them from showing that stuff to minors. And so really it comes down to will. And they're not going to do it on their own, which is why we've started passing laws to make this happen. But the reality is that the porn sites you just have to look at them this way, because if it was in real life, brick and mortar, this is how we would think about it. They are weirdo adults who are distributing obscene material to minors. That is unacceptable, and we shouldn't allow it.
I guess it's a little bit the flip side of it, but it is interesting that in a few states, we'll go into this, we'll segue into this a little bit. The few states, or quite a few states now, that have implemented some kind of age verification law, then the porn industry is like, fine, we don't want to be here at all. It's like, why is it so important to you guys that someone who's under, is it 18 or is it 21?
It's 18.
Yeah, 18. Okay, and that's not like, we're still talking about early adolescence, mid adolescence in some ways, unfortunately or fortunately. But so an 18-year-old, why is it so important for you that someone under 18 be allowed onto your website when Pornhub, etc., they've acknowledged people are being trafficked, there's violence, there's minors. Oh, we're trying to moderate it, or what they'll claim they're doing. They're probably not. And but so they pack everything up and leave the state because they're so mad that someone who's under 18 can't see it. Is exactly to your point. What kind of creeps it's so important to them to show minors lewd, gross, violent sexual acts?
The kind of creeps that understand that kids seeing their graphic material is essential to their business model.
Yeah.
And that's why they're doing it. It's just like how cigarette companies used to advertise to kids, flavored cigarettes, all of that. It's because they know that that's how the human brain works, that if you develop an addiction as an 11-year-old, you're not going to get rid of that. It's going to be incredibly hard to do. Where, if you don't see pornography until you're 18 years old, I'm not saying you couldn't fall into it, but it's one of those situations where you're less likely to. Now, as a 36-year-old, I'm not going to go pick up a pack of cigarettes and start smoking and get addicted to it. It's just not going to happen. So I think that's a big part of it. And then also, what they're doing, they're trying to generate adult outrage. And the thing that's a huge advantage for us is that nobody's calling their member of Congress to say, why did you take away my porn? Right? This is a shameful thing that even adults don't like that they do.
Right.
And so it's going to be really hard for them to build any sort of grassroots special interest group type thing, because the reality is nobody wants this stuff. Most people who look at porn don't want to look at porn. So we should definitely take comfort, I suppose, in them leaving those states and continue what we're doing.
Yeah. And to your point, it's such a bad, on its face, if you were talking to a college student on campus and you're doing, one of those man on the street kind of interviews, and you're like, hey, should, people be allowed to show minors porn? And you hold it to them. Who's going to say yes? Even if they are supportive of ethical, and let's just change the names, whatever. It's not a winning argument to campaign on, let's show minors this stuff. They always have to reframe it and kind of call it something different and paint it as free speech and things like that. All right. So moving more into the truth section of your chapter, you say that the best ways to protect children from the porn industry is that we should regulate it and we can regulate it. We've talked a little bit about the should we regulate it, but can you expand on that just a little bit more? And then we'll move into the can, some of those practical ways we can regulate it.
Well, the should is pretty simple. Porn isn't free speech, and there is no First Amendment right to distribute obscene content to minors. And that our entire country's history agrees with that. even the Supreme Court cases in that everyone references, the Reno v. ACLU, Ashcroft v. ACLU, they didn't say there's a First Amendment right to distribute to kids. What they said is that you can't interfere with an adult's free speech. And so, look, I don't agree with that. I don't think that pornography is free speech even for adults. But I think it's important to show that, hey, we actually can protect kids. We just have to do it in the way that is least restrictive to adults, which is what age verification is. Ultimately, what these laws in the states have done is to say, okay, we just need an ID check at the door, or using consumer data, or using biometrics, or whatever it is. I mentioned this earlier, but you can even do a hand wave, and they're able to determine your age based on that now, which is pretty incredible technology. So this is where we got to go with this. But I think we have to move past this idea, and I think we have politically, that this is just an issue we can't touch. Most Americans, and more importantly, most parents, want us to do this, and so we should move forward with it.
Yeah. Why do you use the term regulate versus saying it should be banned outright? Is one of those more like, do you think there would be constitutional issues with us saying it's a ban outright, all adults for all time, all the websites should be banned, destroyed? I mean, I obviously, and especially from a Christian perspective, if we could snap our fingers tomorrow and just make all of it disappear, our whole world would be so much better. But do we say regulate versus ban because we're trying to maintain some sense of practicality, or it's kind of go ahead.
That's exactly right. Now, look, the reality is we're on good footing where, there's been polls that have shown if you ask people, should we ban pornography, it's like split, right? So it's not like we're way behind the eight ball or anything there. The American people are on our side. But, when we talk about this, I think right now, because we're in a point where it's just unfettered porn access for everyone, including 11-year-olds. I think starting with age verification and building through laws, using the laws as a teacher, building a culture where, okay, we kind of accept that pornography isn't necessarily a good thing, then I think that leads to where you can build on more later. Again, we have obscenity laws on the books. They were never repealed. And there might be some debate on this in like FedSoc circles or lawyer circles or whatever, but all pornography is obscenity. There's no such thing, I suppose you could make the argument that, pictures of models in like the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, maybe that doesn't constitute obscenity, but what you see online is not that. Right? It's much more graphic. It's always intercourse or worse. So I think it's pretty easy here to make the case that our laws currently ban pornography. We just haven't been enforcing it.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. What are some practical things that states have done or then that we would recommend they do to regulate the porn industry?
So we're starting with age verification laws at the website level, which basically says if you're a website and you're distributing on your website this type of material, you have to put age verification guards up to protect kids from your content. That is a really good start because it will, any US-based website that wants to do business in these states will have to do that. But it is only a first step. I think ultimately we have all these foreign porn purveyors. We have to do something about that. We have states that don't have laws like this where they're going to need federal action. And so I think we have to recognize, okay, this is a first step, but there's more to do. I've heard people talk about, potentially doing age verification at the App Store level. So where Apple and Google would basically be responsible for making sure that obscene material isn't going to kids. That sounds like a really good idea. There's been the idea of device filters and having a requirement in place where, again, it would be Apple, or Google. But if you have a phone that you're selling, you have to put this thing into place. That would be a good idea. We're talking about things that get progressively harder and harder politically because it's easy. Again, I mentioned this. Nobody's really standing up for the porn industry. Once you get into the big tech part of it, suddenly that changes a little bit. But, I think we have to look at incremental ways to do this. So I'm really excited. And, this is something I'm hoping that we work on soon. Nobody, including the American porn industry, should be happy about foreign porn websites distributing their content here in the U.S. I don't mean to be like a trade protectionist or anything, but that's just a reality. And so I think we should definitely take action against any obscene content that foreign actors, oftentimes, even our enemies like China or Iran, if they're distributing that to our kids, we should be blocking that. No question.
Right. Yeah, it feels like there's a number of things. It should be bipartisan. Christians, non Christians, everyone should kind of be able to agree on pretty easily. I was thinking in the previous question that you answered about the organization like Fight the New Drug, which is
Mm-hmm.
not associated with any sort of religious or conservative or political thing at all. So I do think there's been a really positive shift in some places in culture, maybe with studies that are coming out. I think a lot of with what's happening with young people who are watching porn and being addicted to porn, especially that's violent, and then what's happening as they are dating and acting out sexually, and people are able to immediately see what they're watching that's violent is directly impacting their relationships. So that's pretty encouraging that even on the cultural front there's been some of that shift, because we know with the big things like slavery and abortion, there has to be sort of two tiers, right? We
Mm-hmm.
need laws, we need good laws, things that the government should protect its citizens and protect the most vulnerable, but you also need a huge cultural shift. And so I guess thinking, yeah, a little bit more of the cultural side, or like within the home or the family. This will be our final question. So you point out in the chapter that one of the lies is that parents can just totally do this on their own. If your kids have ever seen porn, you're a terrible parent. Kind of that, maybe some people kind of have that idea. And you're saying it's not something for parents to do alone, or that they can do alone. Can you speak to that a little bit? And then maybe, yeah, just talk about what should parents, maybe if they're listening and they're like, well, I do feel like I'm kind of alone. What am I supposed to be doing? What are the practical things they can do?
Well, they should be doing everything in their power. I mean, I don't want to say that parents can't do anything. I just don't think it's fair to suggest that that if they fail, that it's their fault. Which I've actually heard that from legislators and activists trying to make this argument that you are a bad parent if you can't do this. That's insane, right? So I do think a big part of this is having this conversation early with kids about why this stuff is harmful, because the reality is, and I've heard this from some of my parent friends who have teenage boys, you just kind of have to assume that they are, and recognize up front, okay, well, why is this bad, why is this harmful, why is it wrong? But I'll tell you, one of the things that is encouraging is that this cultural movement, you mentioned Fight the New Drug, which is an excellent group, excellent website for resources, but you're right, this isn't actually inherently a Judeo-Christian argument. A lot of the folks who are making these arguments are making it from the left, even, right? So and it's because it's a sexual health issue to a degree. This is really bad for you. Looking at pornography, especially at a young age, having this warped view of how relationships should go and what sex is and what it's for is really harmful. And so I'm certainly, as I said, my oldest is 6 years old. I'm not looking forward to this conversation, but if things don't change, or even if they do, at some point I'm going to have to talk to them about pornography and why it's bad, and not just from the angle of it's a sin, which it is, obviously, but that it's really harmful and will hurt your relationships with women in the future if you fall into that.
Yeah. Well, and even the point of it's, think about the people who are being harmed that are the object of the viewing, whether it's
Right.
whether it's a screen or whether it's in written form, or even for women. I mean, like romance novels and more that sort of thing is more what's traditionally appealed to women. And so women might be able to say, oh, well, there's no person being harmed in those. But then it goes back to your original point. It still is retraining your brain and damaging maybe on the internal sense. So there's things in both ways to really be considerate of.
Well, and you mentioned this, but I think we have a secular moral that everything is just about consent.
Mhm.
And so as long as what you're seeing in a pornographic video, as long as the actress consented to it, it's fine. No, right? Like, you're exploiting that person, whether they got paid, whether they did it willingly or not. Like,
Right.
you're a gawker, a voyeur looking at, I mean, it's horrific to think about when you actually process it. And that's why, I'll tell you, this is a joke, I guess, from that I've heard from a lot of guys, but there is this phenomenon where guys especially will be looking at pornography, And then immediately after they're done looking, they shamefully close all their tabs and exit out. And they're just like, ugh, right? It's because they know that what they did was not just sinful, but fundamentally disordered and wrong. Right. So I think there is this cultural context here, and we have to continue to promote it outside of just the traditional religious ways, which are important as well.
Right. Yeah, it's great points. Jon, thanks so much for your contribution to the book. We're really excited. It's coming out at the end of September, and I'm sure all of you will hear more about it. But thanks so much, Jon.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This has been the Them Before Us podcast. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you for joining the movement.